Welcome to this lecture in AP World History for the issue of Centralization of Empires. Yeah, I know, sounds really exciting, right? But actually, there's a really good reason why you need to know this. Have you ever had an experience where you're at school and you need to get something done and you go into an office to get it done and find out there's just a lot of rules and procedures? Or maybe you've heard from your parents going to the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, and oh my goodness, what an experience. Long lines, lots of rules, and people behind desks who don't really want to be there, right? This is called centralization of states or centralization of government. And while it sounds really bad, there's actually some really good reasons for this. And every single one of our empires has this in it, and it has to do with how you make things run efficiently. But of course, there are downsides. So let's get into it and talk a little bit about the importance of centralization of empires. Okay, so what's the role of centralization of empires? Why do we have this? Well, it gets into the issue of hierarchies. And while it's true that hierarchies have their problems, hierarchies are kind of hard to get rid of. We've been having hierarchies since almost the beginning of human civilizations. Why? Because hierarchies allow us to create specialized jobs. They allow us to create people who can run governments, people like kings, people like clerics or priests, people like merchants, people like landholders, people like peasants. Now, all of these things are really necessary in order to make a society work. But at the same time, they can also have their problems. Hierarchies create inequalities. Hierarchies create antagonism and division. Hierarchies oftentimes lead to the people up at the top taking advantage of those at the bottom. So there's the positive of efficiency and specialization of roles, meaning people know what they're supposed to do. There's the downside of inequality. Okay, the masculine archetype. What the heck is that? So there was this guy a long time ago, a psychologist. His name was Carl Jung. And Carl Jung came up with an idea. He came up with an idea called the archetype. The archetype is the idea that there are these deep down, sort of unconscious ways for us to imagine the world. And they're kind of rooted inside of our ways of doing things. They are implicit to the way that we do things. One of the biggest archetypes that we're going to find, symbolic archetypes, is that of the masculine male father figure. So for a long time in human societies, we have had hierarchies based on what's called patriarchy. Patriarchy is when things are run by males. Now, when we say that, you might think, oh, you mean like biological males, right? Not necessarily. A woman can be in charge of a male patriarchy. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. These things, these patriarchies, are really symbolic in many ways. And the idea surrounds the idea of what it means to be masculine. In other words, how we gender things. Now, the way that we tend to think of masculinity and gender are people who are in charge, who structure strong rules, who provide strength, and who make decisions based upon black and white choices, either or. That's the idea of the patriarchy. So now we get to that thing that we were talking about at the beginning of this video lecture, the bureaucracy. So within patriarchies, what oftentimes gets established are what's called bureaucracies. What the heck is that? A bureaucracy is a group of offices that help a society to run and make it run efficiently. People basically have different roles within a bureaucracy to make it run. So, for example, a bureaucracy might include people who do accounting, people who run the military, people who run the postal service, people who run local governance. Now, what's important about bureaucracies is that people kind of want to get in charge of them. Why? Because in any kind of bureaucracy, if you can get in charge of an office, that means that you're kind of rising up in the society. Good example of this is Chinese Confucianism. In Chinese Confucianism, the bureaucracy and the patriarchy were formed around the idea of filial piety, family roles, both within the family as well as in the offices above the family. And they tended to get symbolized by the idea of patriarchy, that it was the masculine figure who would be in charge, the father figure of each one of these offices. Now, how'd you get into one of these offices in China? You got into something called the civil service exam. And this was reserved for sons of families. Sons of families would learn about things like Confucianism. They would then take a test, and if they passed that test, they could fulfill the roles of the bureaucracy. Now, keep in mind why that's important. It allows for people to be skilled and trained in offices to get things done. But for families, it was also really important because it gave them honor and recognition and status for getting their sons into these bureaucracies. What ended up happening was families hired tutors to do this, which meant it was typically the upper class who were able to succeed within this kind of a system. Okay, this brings up one of the biggest threats that centralized empires always fear. And it's the issue of practicality versus spirituality. So we all know from trade, right? Cultural synthesis takes place. New ideas come in. China's a good example. Within China, we have new ideas like Confucianism and Buddhism and Hinduism, all influencing China at the time. Now, that's a really good thing. In fact, I'm going to make the argument throughout this class that actually you want to have multiple ideas because they compete with each other and create innovation. But a lot of times, people who are in charge of bureaucracies, especially ones of patriarchy, fear that when new ideas are brought in, they could undermine their authority. So there's always a fight between that practicality, the desire for new innovations and ideas, versus the fear of causing impurity from something to come from the outside. Okay, so let's wrap all this up. Centralization of empires, so important. Empires need to have centralized offices to run things efficiently. They get symbolized by the idea of patriarchy, that it has to be led by a male father figure. This is not biological. This is not something that's inherent or essential. It's something that's gendered. In other words, it's a symbolic cultural meaning that is given to it. The fear, oftentimes, of the people in these positions is that they need innovation, but they're afraid of outside cultural impurity coming in. And keep in mind the practicality of all of this, the use of bureaucracies in order to run things, trained people. Now, as we talked about at the beginning, all this hierarchy and bureaucracy can be great for efficiency, but it can also create inequalities. Okay, see you in class.